mixed up now.
No One Left's the most recent one.
Yeah, and that's the one I'm reading.
Right.
And we'll be talking about everything. Anyway, let me introduce you properly. First, say that I was introduced to your work listening to BBC Radio 4, the PM program, when Evan Davis interviewed you. I forget what the story was. It was related to what, demography and all the subjects you do. Wasn't that long ago. And then I got in touch with you, and since then have read Tomorrow's People and your new book. So let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Dr. Paul Morland. Paul is author
Can I
and
ask you
broadcast.
to pause for a minute?
Yes.
We're going to get a peal of bells, which is quite charming, but
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about the
once
bells.
okay, they
We,
won't go on, then we'll just have a ring on the quarters.
that'll be nice. Well,
Okay,
no,
carry on in that case.
you're in France, so that sounds good. We need some church bells. I always miss I grew up in a Swiss village, and we always had the church bell, say midi, and the kids would walk home and have lunch. It was a civilized sort of
Right.
place. So if the bells are fine. So anyway, I'll continue with the introduction. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Dr. Paul Morland. Paul is an author and a broadcaster who writes and speaks about population and big demographic trends across the world, both contemporary and historic. He's the author of Tomorrow's People, which I've got here and we'll be talking about, and The Future of Humanity in 10 Numbers, and the newly released No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children, which suggests that there are just too few babies being born for humanity to replace itself. I have been interviewing a number of people, including Brad Wilcox, who has written a book called Get Married, um, and some other people, Catherine Pakaluk and others who are writing on the subject of demographics. It's
Yeah, in
something,
fact, Anna blurbed my book, as we say in the trade. So she read it and she
yeah,
wrote some nice things on the cover.
good. Well, I'm very interested in your work. And as I said, I listened to you on the BBC with Evan Davis, who, by the way, I invited to be interviewed on this show. And he wrote a nice letter back saying that as a BBC presenter, they can't do things that are terribly political. And one of these days I want to talk to him because he's a good journalist. But let me just say that the subject that you're covering, and that I'll introduce by reading a quote from your book, is one that is gradually creeping into the general consciousness, and that is when you look at countries like Japan and you realize that they literally are on course to disappearing as a country because they're not allowing immigration either. It's pretty bleak. And of course, coming out of the 1960s, the idea was the population bomb and Paul Ehrlich, and we were all going to die because there were too many people. There would be sort of Malthusian poverty. Actually, with the increase in population, as you point out in your book, the opposite has happened. The world is better off, and so forth. So there's a lot there. Let me read a quote from No One Left, as a kind of an open, if you like. We still need people to do things just as we always have. We are already short of them, and it is only going to get worse. This seems a bold claim when the world's population has just reached 8 billion, its highest ever level, and is continuing to grow. But scratch beneath the surface, and a very different picture emerges. Yes, the number of people on the planet is still growing, but their rate of growth has halved since the 1970s and is continuing to fall. And while the overall number of people is gently peaking, the upward slope ever flatter, the impending zenith is ever closer. Humanity is rapidly aging. And then, of course, there's a lot more that I can read from and talk about, but let's just begin there. So Tomorrow's People and No One Left, these two books, as well as other work you've done, make the case in terms of just the demographic facts, the replacement level that so many countries are falling beneath. One thing I found very interesting in your work is pointing out that this is happening in all cultures. This is not just Western culture. Islamic countries and so forth are undergoing the same thing. You talk about education of women, opportunity, less babies. There's a lot of quote unquote reasons, but the effect irrespective of the reasons, is, I think, far more dramatic and serious than most people account for. So let's just start there.
Well, I could start on so many subjects. You've covered a lot of ground. One thing I would say is it does seem strange if the population of the world is bigger than it's ever been. How can we possibly be running out of people? And
Yeah.
the answer is understanding the balance of retirees to people of working age.
Mm.
And a statistic I like to quote is Japan. When Japan got to about 100 million people in the 1960s, there were as many as 8 people of working age for every retiree. And then the population kept growing, and now it's falling. When it gets back to 100 million, which I think will be in the 2040s or 2050s, it will be more or less one worker for every retiree. So you might say 100 million people in Japan was working pretty well in the 60s. What's the problem when it gets back to 100 million? And the answer, of course, is the age ratio has changed enormously. And moving the retirement date by a few years, which, by the way, Macron has tried and lost huge amounts of capital,
Yeah.
political capital. Putin tried and had to back down on that one. It's hard to do, but even if you do that by a few years, you're not going to have much effect on going from 8 workers to one retiree
Yeah.
to one worker to one. So there's a big issue there about aging itself, how that unbalances economies, unbalances the taxpayers from the consumers of healthcare and pensions. So that's a huge issue. And there's another issue you touched on, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, which is the cultural issue of where this is happening. When we first noticed it happening, it was a European thing, somewhat a North American thing, although actually the United States had better fertility. Everywhere in the developed world pretty much went down below 2 or 2.1 in the early 70s. But a lot of places, including the States, sort of stayed up there, not too low, not too far below it. Now lots of places are falling. And what's interesting is that what seemed to be a European phenomenon or a white European origin phenomenon has gone global. So the fall in fertility rates in the States, for example, is very much driven in the last few years by the Latino or Latina fertility rate falling down towards that of the population as a whole.
Sure.
And that's not surprising because second generation people converge with the norms. And also back in Mexico, in 1970, when mass immigration from Mexico started, Mexican women were having 5, 6, 7 children. Today, they're having 2 or fewer. So there's this huge global convergence. Countries in East Asia, quite poor countries in Southeast Asia and in the Caribbean, have low fertility. I believe I'm right in saying that if you take all the states and territories of the US, Puerto Rico has the lowest of all, which reminds me of that famous line from West Side Story. Always the money owing, always the population growing. Well, it ain't growing in Puerto Rico anymore, at least not based on fertility rates. So what seemed like a rich country, white European issue is clearly a global issue affecting everywhere from Thailand to Jamaica. And it seems to be a condition of modernity rather than the product of any one particular culture.
Yeah, there's so much here. It's hard to know where to start. Let me just jump in with another quote that I think will open some doors. There are other ways in which the fertility rates can reinforce themselves. One, for example, is through the expectation and experience of family size. When people have small or no families, conditions for those with children are likely to become more difficult. Less thought will be given to accommodating the young in urban design or product design, making it harder to get about with buggies or find suitably sized accommodation or cars. A second way is that societies with small family size set the expectations for future generations. Those from large families have historically been ready to adjust themselves to having small families, but not vice versa, creating a downward ratchet in family size. And I think that's so interesting because, something I want to dig into both in regard to Tomorrow's People, which is a terrific book, and then this book that I'm reading, No One Left, is that you talk both about cultural influences and then just sort of international influences, which cannot be so specifically cultural. Muslim countries and others, very different from Western countries. I don't know how to ask this question properly, but what is the thread that links all of this? In other words, I kind of understand, the post 1970s, women entering the labor market. I understand all the, in my own culture. And then you see this cropping up in what we would regard as traditional style cultures in other parts of the world. And yet the same thing is happening, obviously not linked to 1970s American and British feminists in a direct sense. What's the thread linking all of this? And we'll be talking more about the effect of it. But first of all, before we get into why this is a bad thing for humanity in general and the planet, talk about the thread linking this phenomena globally from the 1970s until the present. What's going on out there?
Well, it's a difficult one because we thought it was about the culture of white Europeans, if you like. And you might have made that argument in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then you started seeing it elsewhere. And people sort of come up with all sorts of theories, which it's actually very easy to give a counterexample for. So I was on one interview and he said, "Oh, it's alcohol, isn't it?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, I mean, slightly jokingly, well, people used to drink a lot and then they'd have sort of fumbles in the dark when they were drunk and unintended consequences." And I said, "Look, if it were about alcohol, Muslim countries, many of which do have high fertility rates, if a lack of alcohol were the problem, then Muslim countries, many of which ban alcohol, would have very low fertility rates."
Yeah.
So other people say, "Oh, it's feminism." And then I'd say, well, look at some of the lowest fertility rates in the world in Japan and Korea. Those are not particularly feminist countries.
Yeah.
And then other people will say, "Oh, it's urbanization." But then you can point to Israel, which is a highly urban, a highly educated and quite wealthy society, which seems to be a counterexample. You can say, "Oh, it's expensive housing," but look at Southeast Europe, the Balkans, cheap housing, low fertility. "Oh, it's expensive childcare," and so on. But you can find highly subsidized childcare in the Baltic states and Germany, and yet very low fertility rates. So it's a bit puzzling at first. And all I can offer is that it's actually a condition of modernity, which itself is maybe as vague as culture. But what I think I mean is that if you have a urban, prosperous lifestyle and aspirations and female education, lots of things that are very good, and you don't have a countervailing culture, a countervailing narrative, then you will have low fertility rates. So you have to believe and want to have children to replace yourself, to keep your nation and your country going, to have some kind of sense of mission. If you want to combine modernity, the ability to look at a mobile phone and envisage, if you're not living a wealthy, prosperous, urban, modern life, you can aspire to it. And people in quite poor countries like Jamaica, for example, has a very low fertility rate. Maybe they're still poor, but they're aspiring with mobile phones, with the ability to see what another life might be like. They're no longer stuck out in the countryside, ignorant of what the alternatives are. So I think those conditions of modernity are inevitably driving people to a lower fertility rate, inevitably, unless there's something that is countering it. Well, what might counter it? Israel's a very special case, which maybe we'll talk about. A huge sense of national mission, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of neighbors wishing to wipe them out. That's unique. But if you look at the States, if you look at Europe, religious practice definitely correlates with higher fertility rates. Actually being a little more on the right politically, being more nationalistic, certainly in the States correlates with a higher fertility rate. So Republican counties versus Democrat counties, you're down to the county level, and I suspect down to the individual level. So I think in a nutshell, it is about modernity, and it's modernity plus nothing pushing against it in an alternative direction, a kind of ideology or faith or belief or set of priorities that make having children so important that it overcomes the pressures of modernity.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Let me just reintroduce you. I'm talking to Dr. Paul Morland, who is the author, who has written books on population and demography. Tomorrow's People is a book that I've read and I have here, and we are talking about that, but also a newly released title, which I have read, and it's both are terrific books. And, to belabor an overused term, they really are must reading because this is a huge deal. This is as if you wake up one morning and somebody informs you that nuclear weapons have been invented, and you say, "What? I've never heard of such a thing." It's that big a deal because this is it. This is the future. Countries like Japan are going to disappear. We're going to have a hard time in the States caring for anybody who's elderly very, very soon in terms of how the numbers are playing out. No one left. Why the world needs more children, which suggests that there are too few babies for humanity to replace itself. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which you're listening to here on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, having said all that, let me just ask you a question, a sort of a broad philosophical question. It seems to me that when you use the word modernity, one of the implications is a kind of a secular science-based view of reality, which does not have room for as much sensitivity toward what we might call the more nurturing side of life. I noticed this very directly in that I have 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. 3 of my grandchildren live across the street. I've been doing childcare for them for the last 15 years, along with my wife, Jeannie, and all the school pickups. And quite often, I know a lot of the moms who are in the parking area. We've talked and we've known each other for all these years. And they're always sort of complimenting me on, it's so great that you're doing all this, as if it was somehow unusual. And it really has started a train of thought for me that I've been writing about and talking about, which is really, how do you define success? And to me, at age 72, success is my relationships and the pleasure I get from them. It has nothing to do with career. It has everything to do with the value of those relationships. I see that very clearly in my own life. I also see a trajectory in so many younger people I've seen who, for instance, go to New York and pursue something and they want to do it. It doesn't quite turn out the way they thought it would. So the restaurants and the travel and the extreme sports or whatever they're into eventually plays out and they're not left with much. And then they look at Jeannie and me and our relationship with our grandchildren, and they're kind of saying, how did you do this? As if it's some sort of interesting other way of living. Essentially, if I can share my 2 cents, any time that I'm faced with a choice between careerism or jobism or workism and doing what I'm doing right now, which is a building project with my 14-year-old grandson, Jack, and we're doing carpentry together. The joy that I have in working with him and making lunch for him every day during his summer holiday, outweighs anything I've ever done in career-wise. Literally, I'm not just talking emotionally here, but I can just say literally 2 lines are forming. I don't give a shit about that line, but I treasure every moment. So that's a very long preamble, but I want to ask you if modernity is very bad at making choices in favor of what I'll just call living, rather than careerism. Forget feminism or whether women are working. I mean, the whole career, gross national product way of looking at things, I just think has led to a real dead end and a kind of a terminal despair that you see reflected in all kinds of ways in terms of suicide numbers and self-harm and depression and psychiatric care. I think if you were from another planet, aside from the demography, you would look at what modernity has produced in terms of values and appreciation for what matters to me. And if you got an honest answer from just a really simple question, how's all this working out for you? The demographics are just part of it. But there's a whole other rest of kind of malaise that I think is really coming to the surface in people's lives that tend to be very empty if they're filled with this kind of a getting ahead mentality rather than relationships. So I think that's something to do with it. And I've talked too long, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, you raised so many interesting issues. And there are really 3 things I want to say in response. First of all, that my books are quite sort of scientific, numeric. They talk about the downsides from a fiscal, from a monetary, from an economic point of view of not having children. And that's because these things are very measurable. And my editor probably cut a lot of what I would call the poetry, which is right, because I, like you, have hugely benefited and hugely enjoyed having three children. I now have two grandchildren with a third on the way, and I'm always shocked when people say to me, I mean, I don't think I'm 59. Oh, you look too young to be a grandfather.
Yeah.
And I want to say, any competent 40-year-old should, at least biologically, physically, be perfectly able to be a
Yeah.
grandfather. I
Yeah.
don't think I look 40. So something's gone wrong. And I completely agree with you that however much you put in the numbers, the ratios, the data, the things you can measure, um, it's not only that having children is the most wonderful thing, and I do say it from time to time, in fact, I dedicated my latest book to my wife. I say my co-pronatalist and our two first grandchildren. Um, but it's not just that I don't talk about it that much because it's hard to quantify, but also that in the data, there are a lot of personal tragedies of people who never get to enjoy that. Now, I know that not everybody wants to have children. Some people say they never want to and then regret it, and some people say they never want to and don't regret it. But if the data says people want to have 2 to 3 children in most countries, and they're only having 1 to 2, and that means a lot of cases where people aren't having any. And I think that's very sad. So I think people are missing out on the best and most important thing in life. That's my
Mm.
perspective, although I can't prove it.
Right.
I can't give you a number, but I'm with you on that. And like you, I do a lot of grandparent care. And we do it because we love seeing our grandchildren, but also we want to send the message to our children, we're there for you. So
Yeah.
don't hesitate to keep going, whether
Yeah.
you're 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know. It's their choice.
Yeah.
But grandparental support is really important for people. And if you live, people having children, and if you live near, I mean, we had enormous support from my parents and my parents-in-law. My parents live closer, so we got my mother, who's 90, has an amazing relationship with her 7 grandchildren because she put a lot of effort and time in when they were tots and then when they were teenagers, and they still all flock around her. And that makes her life much, much more meaningful and enjoyable and vibrant in her 90s. So that was one thing I was going to say. A degree of poetics rather than just the science of demography is
Yeah.
probably called for. The second thing is that government policy can only do so much. I think although people say they want 2 to 3, if they don't put it as a high enough priority, if it's something they want theoretically, but it's well down on the list compared to all the other
Right.
things, then government policy is kind of pushing against a closed door.
Hmm.
And that's why I think you actually need a shift. I mean, you haven't finished the book yet, but when you get to the end, the penultimate chapter is what can government do for us? And the final chapter is what can we do for ourselves? And I
Yeah.
think unless we undergo some kind of cultural revolution, some kind of
Yeah.
complete shift in the culture that results in people making this their highest priority, the thing without which that's the first thing you organize your life around,
Hmm.
then government policy is going to be very difficult to have much of an effect. And it
Well,
reminds me of people in Seoul when I was in South Korea saying, oh, we can't afford children. And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you what your priorities on expenditure should be. But if if I hadn't been able to live in London and have a family, I'd have moved somewhere else. I'd have moved somewhere cheaper.
sure.
And for me, it would have been a priority. I'm not telling you it has to be your priority. I'm just saying that's why you're not having them and understand the consequences. The last thing I'd say is we don't want to go too far in dissing modernity. And this is really the basis of my book. So we hugely benefit from many things in modernity,
Yeah.
from
Absolutely.
ample food, from energy, from air conditioning and heating, from an extraordinary variety of experiences. And so maternity is very seductive and has many positive things. And
Yeah.
I think if you believe that we'll have to go back to the cave or the hovel or the cottage in order to reverse this, then
Yeah.
the outlook's very bad. So I'm trying to say, can we find a way which keeps the benefits of modernity and keeps the baby and not the bathwater, if you like?
Yeah.
And can we find a way that keeps the rights of women, the ability of women to go into the workforce if they want, and their equality? Are lots of good things that have changed. Can we
Yeah.
keep any of that? And can we keep all of it? Can we keep reasonable standards of living? without going down this hole of spiraling low fertility rate? How can we reinvent a society
Mm.
that is modern and prosperous and urban and educated, where women have got the rights to participate alongside men in the workplace, but we find ways creatively, we reorder our priorities, and we have fertility alongside modernity? I'm not ready yet to throw in the towel. I mean, I make the point in the book, we're not even trying. In the UK, I'm not aware that any frontline politician, any minister or government minister or frontline politician has ever said anything on this subject. And I
Right.
believe the last US president to comment on the question of fertility rates was Teddy Roosevelt,
Yeah.
110 plus years ago.
Yeah.
So can we at least try? Can we at least have a go at combining the benefits of modernity with 2 to 3 children per couple? Not astronomical, I don't think. And
Yeah.
maybe it's a hiding to nothing, and maybe we'll fail. But the point of my book really is to say we should try and combine these two things. Let's start talking about it and finding ways in which we can do that.
Yeah, you talk about grandparenthood in the book. I had a passage that I was going to quote here where it just sort of starts out, the role of grandparents is essential. In the course of writing this book, I was fortunate enough to become a grandparent twice over and so forth. But what I wanted to point out is another factor too. I just interviewed some people a couple days ago who actually are giving me notes on my new book now that they're reading for me. And that is they've written a book called What Are Children For? And one of these authors has children and the other does not. And they brought up a very interesting point in the book, which I talked with them about, which apropos of what you're talking about here, sort of hanging on to the best of modernity, but making some adjustments. And that is what they call, they term slow love, in which the dating process takes so long and then to commit takes so long. It's just a question of do the math, not just the fertility math. You know, older grandparents who never get a chance to really help with their kids because now they're quite old. If someone's waited that long, they talk about this slow love thing as a actual barrier to not just having children, if any, but just any permanent romantic and or bonded attachment whatsoever. So by the time you've gone through the app dating scene on your phone and you've tried all these various people, and then you live together for a while, but if it doesn't turn out to be your soulmate instantly, the culture is not telling you to work at the relationship, you kind of dump it and move on. I think they bring up a very good point, and that is that it isn't so much modernity or feminism that is the enemy here. It's this idea of, the old idea of the, you know, perfection is the enemy of the good. In other words, the very idea of trying to get together with anyone and make a commitment has now slowed down to a glacial pace for so many people. I don't know whether you've looked at some of that.
Well, it's not something I'm an expert on, and as I've said elsewhere, um, I at the age of 59, I'm probably not the best person to talk about the dating
Right,
scene. I went on my first date with my wife in 1985, and we've been married for 32 plus years.
right,
But
right.
there's obviously something in that. Now, is it again for me to say people are being over idealistic, or they're setting their goals too high, they're looking for perfection, and they spend too long looking? There's probably something in that. I think what could be the case, and is more kind of tangible, is that we order our lives in a very particular way. And the way we order them is we do what we call school in Britain, and then what we call university, which you call school, I know, but sort of tertiary education. And sometimes that tertiary education, you then do a master's and on it drags, or,
Yeah,
drags is not the right word. I did my master's when I was married and I had a child while I was doing it in my late 20s, and I didn't do my PhD till my 40s. So I chopped my life up slightly differently. And I think the idea of then you go into the workplace and you work a certain number of years and then you get the next promotion, the next promotion. I think there's something about, can we reorder the way we do these things,
yeah,
given that we
exactly.
have long life expectancy? I mean, the US has disappointingly short life expectancy, but people still live on average to their late 70s, and in much of the world to their mid 80s. Can we not realize that there is a fairly narrow window of fertility? and that we can reorder our world in a way that we
Yeah.
get our education, our last bits of our education at different points. Like, for example, giving free education to people over a certain age who are parents, for example. That would be a good idea. In some countries, it would be a government-led thing, and others it could be philanthropic.
Yeah.
And now there was one Conservative MP who was very keen on this subject, Miriam Cates. Unfortunately, she lost her seat in the bloodbath that we've just had of an election for the Conservative. But she, who I know quite well, was a biology teacher.
Yeah.
And one point she made that I thought was a brilliant, simple little point. It was, we know, we in the room, we pronatalists who were in the over dinner that evening, know that a fertility rate, biological fertility, falls off quite rapidly after the age of 30. And we
Yeah.
know what the shape of that curve looks like. Very few people do. So shouldn't we teach that at school? So just one
Yes.
tiny little suggestion that if you actually taught that at school, at the age of 14 or 15, along with all the other sex education and personal health and all that kind of thing, why, it wouldn't take very long to put that chart up and make that chart part of the learning.
Yeah.
People might model their lives differently, and they might order their lives differently. So that would be what people would do. But I think the whole way institutions work, that sort of natural thinking that that's what you do, you go off and you do this degree and that degree. I think we could try and be a bit more creative in ordering our societies
Yeah.
so that people can start their families younger. And then
Yeah.
you
I
have
was,
the advantage of,
yeah.
as you say, being a youngish. I mean, I became a grandparent when I was 50. Yeah, I don't think that's particularly young, but it does mean my third child is getting married this summer, and hopefully they'll have their kids within a few. So it does mean by the time that, throughout my 70s, throughout my 60s and early 70s, I can be hopefully, if I'm fit, my wife is fit, same age as me, we can be pretty hands-on and active
Yeah.
grandparents.
Exactly.
And if you're sort of a decade or 15 years older, you probably can't be.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book towards the conclusion of No One Left, you say patriarchal attitudes in the home and workplace are inimical to childbearing in modern societies. You do go there, and I would just add to that when you look at articles, for instance, coming out of Korea and the antagonism between a lot of the male population and what they regard as the demands of feminism, we've gone to another stage now of not just not hitting replacement numbers, but even the association of men and women is being colored by a kind of an ideological career-oriented drift, which is inimical to basically well-grounded romantic relationships, let alone having children. You were talking about reordering the order in which we do things. It just happens that my daughter Jessica is a very successful woman in business. She's the CEO of an investment company in New York City. She had her kids in her early 20s, then finished her education, then started her career. And she wrote me an email a little while back in which I had asked her about her trajectory. And she said, I often tell people that one of the reasons that I've been successful is because what I learned through parenthood and staying home with my kids when they were young and reversing the order of what I was doing meant that when I got into business, I actually was a grown up, knew how to function, was disciplined, and was not trying to balance career and children because now my children were in school. And that gave me the freedom to really get into it. And she's a lobbyist for the 50 biggest energy companies in Europe to the European Union. She's addressed the General Assembly there. She's got this career trajectory that supposedly is, what people want. And yet her point of view is that the reason she was able to do this is she dropped out of New York University, got married young, lived in Finland for 20 years, stayed home with her kids when they were preschool age, finished her degree in Finland, got hired, by the way, by a British company to begin with, and has an office in Modena, Italy, and one in Brussels and one in New York, and is doing that. But the order in which she did it was completely never something even discussed with college age young people in America, that look, you can actually fall in love, have a partner, and have kids, and this is not going to stop your career. It's just you flip the order to actually be in line with the actual chart of fertility that you were talking about. And this can lead to a very good place. I'm not saying that everybody can duplicate what my daughter did, but along with educating people on the actual fertility facts, instead of this crazy idea that after you're 30, you can still do all this and freeze your eggs and it'll work out, actually talk about what works better in terms of just people who do want to have kids, or maybe 2 or 3 kids instead of 1 or none. It might be mentioned to young men and women that following this idea that you follow education out, then you perhaps live with somebody for a while. Then you might just get married into your 30s as a kind of a capstone to your career. Then you might think about children. There's no use having this sentimental idea at the same time. Oh, well, we want 2 or 3 children. Look at what's actually happening to your body and the trajectory of your life. You're not going to be doing this because there is such a thing called reality out there, and biology and evolutionary science is unforgiving, and nobody talks about that.
Well, this is why I get a bit short impatience with all the people I see when I do these kind of talks. I do quite a lot of them who say, oh, it's feminism. It's because of feminism. It's because of feminism. Oh, he thinks women should be in the workplace. He's a fem. I think the trouble is, as you've said, as you pointed out, in patriarchal societies or societies where feminism never really got going, like Japan and Korea, they have the lowest fertility rate, because if women can't combine workforce and children, right, and they get an education, then they're not going to have children. So that's one thing. The story of your daughter reminded me of a friend of mine. Actually, I talked about her in the book, but it got cut. The feminist, I had quite a long chapter about feminism and women, but it got very much reduced. The whole book was cut. I think probably it was a good idea.
I think you should write another book and stick in everything they cut from it.
Well, anyway, friend of mine who's actually, as it happened, she's the non-exec head of the Human Embryology and Fertility Organization in the UK that helps the government set policies around things like IVF. I mean, she has 4 children, and her husband's a biology professor, as it happens. She's a lawyer. But she said, I have my children, and I don't know, I think she was doing some work at the time. And then once they were all in school, that's when I really kind of put the clutch down, as it were, on my career. And I cite my own daughters who got excellent educations as undergraduate, entered the workplace, and very soon married, and didn't start families very early, but one had her first at 27, one her first at 29, which, for very, very educated women is quite early. And I do think we need to think more creatively. Now, of course, it's down to the individual, and societies and institutions can only do so much to assist, although they can do things to assist. But again, it gets back to priorities. If we have a culture in which having children is an afterthought, and self-realization through the workplace is what is valued and what gets you status, then we are not going to be able to combine modernity with high fertility. How do we find a way to do these things together, as your daughter has done, as my daughters have done, as my friend has done? It's about being creative, it's about being supported, and it's about thinking that this is the most important thing in your life. This is what ultimately is going to give your life meaning and value. However much energy and enjoyment you get from your career, this is something you need to do as well as, and I would say in priority too. I mean, having said that, of course, again, just as I said, we need to be realistic about modernity and understand its advantages. Equally, people need to work. People need to work as a living. It's not just about self-actualization. And this is where governments, taxation systems, corporations educational institutions can all support in thinking out of the box being a very limited way of thinking and ordering your life and priorities, which we have got into.
I think, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, because you don't say anything exactly like this in the book, although you do talk about supporting women in their various choices. But I think feminism is not the problem. I think the problem is that feminism was modeled on a male model of the way work is done, that you put it first and ahead of everything, and it was copied, and it didn't translate well into what women want often. And secondly, the men have never caught up. and that feminism is not the problem. I think the problem is male attitudes toward women and their place in the workforce and the lack of making accommodation to the reality of parenthood itself, that the fathers, the males, are not accommodating themselves to parenthood or even being decent partners with another person, and that the feminist demands are completely reasonable. And the only reason they have an impact in this area of demography, I think, is that men have not stepped up. I read a very interesting book a few years ago that I referenced quite a bit called The Old Way. And it's by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, whose father was one of the founders of the Raytheon Corporation. And he took his family in the 1950s to live in the Kalahari Desert for a year with the Sand people, known as the Bushmen, before anybody else got there. And the notes that her mother takes and that she takes, which she published in The Old Way, are quite interesting because these were gathered in the 1950s. In other words, way before 1970s style feminism became a thing. And yet the equality between men and women in that group of hunter gatherers was 100%. The women all worked at the gathering and the men hunted. The way the goods were distributed, the childcare, the fact that teenagers and males were involved in childcare and helping the women because the women had to go out and gather. They were all careerists, otherwise everybody would have died. They knew where the roots and berries were and so forth. What's interesting to me is that I don't think, that our problems in modernity, if you like, are that we have lost sight of certain truths just about the kind of sharing and caring society. I don't think the feminism is the problem. I think we have yet to adjust to the idea that women are full human beings with rights, and that if we want to have families at all, it's not just a matter of state intervention. It's a change in social. It's a social shift we need that puts equality and fairness first in the area of family in a way that actually translates into allowing women to pursue careers and their dreams in full equality with men, but in sync with the actual realities of fertility. Maybe it's too ideological, but since it was done by the Sand people who are in a constant presence in the Kalahari Desert for 80,000 years, that's 80,000, not 8,000, 80,000 years, and they achieve such equality between the sexes and in childcare, I don't understand why that is out of the realm of possibility for us to consider.
Well, I don't think it's out of the realm, and which is why I wrote the book, but I don't think enough people are considering it. Um, in terms of feminism, the one of the things I did write about that isn't in the book that got cut was a history of feminism from the perspective of what it thought about having children. And
Yeah.
the idea that feminism is hostile to having children is really a misunderstanding. If you go back to the roots of, we could call modern in the fullest sense of feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, back at the end of the 18th century, um, she saw having children as a very essential part of what women were about. Many 19th century feminists equally thought feminism was about aid to women, helping women in childbirth and this was something women did. It was essential to women, it was essential to society, and how could you support them in that? It was really only second wave 1970s. I think there was a Canadian feminist, or maybe she was American, called Shulamit Firestone. It's like an extreme case, almost almost deranged case of antenatal feminism. But I think a lot of more modern feminists have rediscovered, or maybe they never lost, the importance of women and their femininity and their childbearing. And I spoke to quite a lot of women. I spoke to Erica Badiocchi. I don't know if you've come across her in the States.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke to Catherine Pakaluk, who we talked about earlier. I spoke to a very brilliant British economist called Vicky Price, who, in fact, all the blurbs I got were from women. So all the things on the cover,
Yeah.
which you won't see because you're reading it on the Kindle version, were from women. So the idea that feminism is inherently anti anti-childbearing, I think, is unhistorical. And the other thing I was going to say is sometimes modernity can come to your help. So I think the advance of technology. I mean, here we are having this just wonderful discussion on Zoom. I'm in France and you're in the States.
Yeah.
Um, this is, in a sense, my work and your work. We don't need to be in this. Well, my daughter um, probably works a day or two at home. And although she works just as hard in those days, she'll be able to drop a baby off at the nursery or pick him up or, and then spend some hours later on doing things when he's in bed. And it gives people flexibility if they're able to have a day or two when they're not having to go into the office. So again,
Yeah.
it's for every company, every individual to figure out what the right model for them is. Given that we have this technology, it's all been accelerated, of course, by lockdowns and COVID. But putting that aside, we have this technology now. What's the right model? I was a business consultant for a long time. Some of my clients wanted me sitting in the office 5 days a week, and others said, we only want you in when you need to be, if you can do meetings remotely. So I think that's a case where technology can be harnessed to a more flexible and more family friendly and child friendly way of bringing up kids.
One thing I wanted to bring up that you do look at in the book is this idea of the conflict between climate crisis as a factor in all of this. I know this comes up a lot in terms of young people saying, well, maybe we don't want any children. Look at the world we're bringing them into. And I always have to smile a little bit because as someone who enjoys reading history, I said, well, what date exactly would you pick? 1939 in Berlin? Would you like to go to the 13th century in Italy and half the population is dying of plague? Maybe a witch burning trial in Salem in the 1600s. What would you pick as the opportune moment when everything is looking up to have a family? Sadly, the human condition is what it is. But since this question is going to come up, my producer, Ernie Gregg, texted me in the notes section. I think it's an important one. How do you approach that? Because obviously this comes up in your discussions and in your presentations. Why are we having any more children? Look at the climate crisis.
So I think there are two angles that environmentalists take to attack pronatalism or to suggest we should have fewer children. One is the ghastly world, how could I bring children into it? And two is another child is another emitter and will make the climate worse. I mean, they're often conjoined, those arguments, but they're strictly speaking separate. So on the first argument, I'm with you. I always say this is the best time to bring children into the world. When I was born in the 1960s, we just missed I just missed the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
The world could have been destroyed at any minute. And the infant mortality rate, so my chances of making it through my first year, while much better than 100 years earlier, perhaps 20 or 25 children in the UK died per 1,000 in their first year. Now it's down to 4. People are better fed, people are better housed, that more people have got central heating. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on.
And by the way, that's a global phenomenon too.
It is a global phenomenon. It's even more dramatic. Yeah, it's even more dramatic if you look at India and China. I mean, I was in India in the 80s and back in the 2010s, and there's still poverty, but it's just of a different order. So I think that perspective is actually historically extremely poorly informed. And if you said, 13th century Italy, they probably think of sunshine and Renaissance or late medieval towers. Right. And, no idea, as you say, the plague. And even without the plague, I mean, goodness, no, toothache and lack of food and very basic accommodations. So we live better now than we ever have. If not now, when? As for the argument that children will be emitters, there's a whole raft of arguments against that. The first is that if you are consuming labour of other people, if you expect there to be a bus driver, a school teacher, a doctor, a nurse, someone bringing the gas to the gas station, everything you do, you're expecting there to be labour, but you're too precious and important and virtuous to have it yourself, then you will be consuming labour but not producing it. And what that means is if there aren't enough children, we'll import people. And very often those people come from extremely low emissions countries, and you're bringing them to extremely high emissions countries. So if you think immigration, you won't have children, but you'll consume the labor of others. That involves immigration, and that involves much higher emissions. There's another sort of line of argument, which is that a child born today, given the way that our technology is progressing, will probably not emit much for 20 years when you live at home. And then in 20 years' time, given the progress we're making technologically, their emissions will be very low. And then the last thing I would say is that we couldn't have 8 billion people on the planet with the technology of 1900 or even 1950. Brilliant technological breakthroughs are what allows us to combine a large population with a robust environment. And technological innovation is not coming out of old societies. Japan has become much less creative since it got so old. And we will lose our creativity, our brilliant new inventions, if we don't have a pool of young people, if we have a small pool of young people who are really can do nothing else but look after the elderly. So young societies will create the solutions to our environmental problems. I am confident of that. And at the same time, I don't think technology will replace the labor. So I was challenged on this, actually. I got an interview in the New Statesman, which is a British left of centre journal, which I think is coming out tomorrow or Thursday. And a very good interview. And she said, well, why are you so pessimistic, if that's the right word, about technology replacing labor? So AI is not the solution. We're still going to need people. But you're so optimistic about technology solving these environmental problems. And I said, just look at the data, look at the history, look at the facts. Technology has indeed helped us massively reduce our carbon footprint.
Yeah.
In the UK, it's back to 19th century levels, despite our much larger population, because we've got renewables and we've got gas where we had coal and so on and so on and so on. So much better boilers and more efficient cars and, solar energy and so on. So we're making these enormous progress in terms of environmental footprint. But at the same time, labor productivity has not improved. So technology, whilst we've had all these amazing, in my work, when I first started work in the mid-80s, I didn't send an email for the first 7 or 8 years. I was in the workplace. We had one computer in the department. I mean, nobody would have heard of an app or Wi-Fi or anything like that.
Yeah.
And yet, despite that, we still have lower productivity growth than we used to have, and we have a huge demand for labor. So the reason I'm optimistic about technology finding solutions to environmental problems, and I don't think that technology will sort out our need for labor, is simply looking at empirical evidence to date.
Yeah. What interests me about your books and your point of view is that in some ways it's out of step with a lot of received wisdom, but that received wisdom itself seems to be so out of step with a very basic fact, and that is humanity's not going anywhere. We're going to be here. The question is, are we limping along with disproportionate aging populations, less and less young people, whole countries disappearing, the instability this will bring? That's sort of the thrust of a lot of what you're writing about. But there's this other aspect that I've already alluded to, and I want to go back to again in your own personal experience, some of which your editors have cut. But I think there's a deeper philosophical, almost spiritual argument, and that is, what is important in life. And the most important thing to me in life is the sense of being needed. I'm 72 years old, and I'm being facetious here, but there's this trend where people go to age segregated communities, retirement communities, and so forth and so on. And I was joking with my wife this morning again about this. We've been together forever, and we have our children and our grandchildren. And talking about, my son calls me up, after I do this podcast, can I drive my grandson, who I was doing carpentry with this morning, down to an event where he's got a captain's meeting with some other soccer kids. And I said, doesn't being needed by your family beat the hell out of going to a retirement community in Florida and catching STDs, or going on a cruise, STDs being sexually transmitted diseases? And I'm sort of joking, but there's a kind of a desperation to life when it is lived segregated away from the family community. And we've done this to old people as well as young people. So, it just seems to me if there's going to be a cultural reformation and a rethinking of this, it can't just be about how many children you have. It has to be about a more profound question, and that is what matters in life and what doesn't matter. What are your priorities on a large thing? And I'd like to talk about that a little bit as we wind this up, because I think the issue of priorities and a cultural kind of rethink and a shift goes beyond questions of feminism or fertility or even the workplace, and it gets into a bigger thing, which is that I think we have lost certain skills which were taken for granted, which is just the business of life itself is actually living. The career is secondary and all this fancy stuff we do. And I think nothing shows up where we have lost the way more than these retirement communities where we cut old people off, park them away from young people. All the studies show that older people who take care of grandchildren and children actually live longer. It has an impact on life expectancy. It's much better for kids and families. At every point these things are examined, the business of living life fully as a human seems to always trump these diversions and these wrong steps we take. And how do you feel about that? Just in terms
I'm
of
sure there's a
philosophy.
lot of wisdom in that. And again, if people want to go off to a retirement community, it's interesting, the retirement community as a phenomenon hasn't really taken off in the UK. And I think in Europe more generally, I mean, that may be for real estate reasons. Which isn't to say you don't have old age homes where people go when they really need to be looked after.
Yeah.
But this idea of going off, say, when like someone like you, fit, healthy, but happens to be in their 70s, early 70s, going off somewhere. That's not a very, for all the faults of Europe, that's not a very European thing. If people want to do that, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to preach at them, but I do think I agree with you that people who get involved with their grandchildren, their children have much richer lives. The other thing, of course, is that when you're younger, you get a lot of meaning and purpose out of your job. And again, I don't want to say that's not important. People need to work for their livelihood. And if, as well as working for your livelihood and getting a wage, you get certain psychic income, you get a pleasure, a pride, and a sense of being needed in the workplace, then that's a wonderful thing too. But the workplace is capricious. And, I think of people, my wife worked incredibly hard, was very successful, and was often working alongside other women who were working very hard but didn't have families. And I didn't know them, but I could tell. And I suppose I've encountered people like, particularly women actually, who've put themselves wholly into their work, who've kind of sacrificed the family for the company. Not because they're sort of altruistic. I mean, they're realistic in a way, but they've kind of allowed their colleagues, their workplace, and their careers to be the most important thing, to give them meaning.
Yeah.
And of course, your family can turn around and slap you in the face, but not, it's a hell of a lot more likely that the employer will turn around and say, thank you for your loyal 15 or 20 years service. Your role is now redundant. Thank you very much. And, to rely on that is something of a hiding to nothing, because in many
Yeah.
cases, if not most, those communities, that workplace, and I've had wonderful relationships with colleagues and enjoyed my work when I was a consultant, going out with colleagues, working with them, working through problems, and
Yeah.
very often away from home. So for part of the week, so we'd go out in the evening and bonded very closely, and we got the job done. But in the end, those were only professional relationships. And the nature of personal relationships is very different. And if you don't realize that, there's something wrong with your personal relationships. And the personal relationships have to be worked at. It's not a given that your relations will stay strong with your spouse or your children. But they should do. Whereas a career, a company, by its very nature, is a contractual relationship. And you need to get beyond, you need to have those contractual relationships in your life. But if you don't have the non-contractual relationships, the relationships based on unconditional love, your life will be very much the poorer for it.
Mm.
And understanding that, realizing that, building your life around that, and the culture recognizing it, is probably the only way that we're going to get our fertility rate up without some kind of calamity happening and having to ditch modernity, which is not something I want to do.
It's a great place to end. And I would just again want to sum up by saying that I've been talking with Paul Morland, and Paul is the author of Tomorrow's People, which I have here, but also the author of a book that I'm reading on Kindle right now. And that is Tomorrow's People is this one, and the Kindle book that I'm reading right now is No One Left: Why the World Needs More Children. And it's a terrific book. I really would urge people to buy it. The complications between American and British publishing means that these books are more easily available on Kindle than getting the hard copy. I would buy both of your books, and I would urge people to do that. Thank you so much for being on. One of these days we're going to do a panel with Brad Wilcox again, and also Catherine Pakaluk and some other people, and the women that we've recently interviewed on What Are Children For? Just going through this. I think it would be wonderful to include you on that. And Ernie will get back in touch with you about that perhaps. The other thing I would ask you is if you have people who are working in this area that you're thinking we would be interested in talking to, or any other area for that matter, please pass on their names to us and make an introduction, because we would love to continue this conversation with other people. If we can. We would also like to add your book that I've been talking about, No One Left, to our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read. And we would like to make that the November selection, if that's okay with you. And maybe get you back on the
and I'd be delighted to come back and talk one-to-one or as a panel, and I'll drop you an email with some ideas on other people who have similar interests.
And when we ring off here, stick around just for a few seconds to talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, because he'll set that up with you so we actually make that happen. And
Excellent.
Paul, I think what you're doing is really, 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 really important, both as an author and just what you're talking about. This subject is huge, and I would just alert people who listen to my podcast and commentary. This is a very, very big subject. It's only going to get bigger, and Paul is one of the kind of canaries in the coal mine who's been talking about this for a long time. So he knows what he's talking about, if I may just say that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paul.